Perry Bellegarde, thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks for the opportunity.
I'm going to start with the first question, and it's the same question I asked the minister, but from your point of view, representing First Nations across the country, concretely, I don't want to talk in niceties and in legalese, concretely, what would this legislation mean to you?
What it means is that First Nations are ready to start reforming a child welfare system that doesn't respect their laws or jurisdiction or cultures or languages. What this means to me is that now there's an opportunity to fix the system. We've done the fixing on the on-reserve system through the delegated authorities, the Indian Child and Family Service systems, with the 4 binding Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decisions. We dealt with that because it was clear that there was discrimination and racism, not having access to the same programs and services there. Well, now there's 40,000 First Nation children in the provincial systems, right across Canada, province by province by province and territory. So where is the process and plan to fix the children and the system that's there for those First Nations children that are languish in provincial care? So what this legislation will do, it will help facilitate and bring together the federal government, provincial government, and First Nations governments to fix that system and exert jurisdiction off reserve as well into that system.
Okay. Do you have any confidence, because I also asked the minister this, do you have any confidence that this legislation will pass before an election?
Yes. We have to push this government to pass this before the next federal election.
But you know that is a very full legislative
agenda. It's a very full agenda because December 14th the House rises. They're not back till January 28th. So we have a very tight time frame. But there's 3 pieces of legislation we want done. We want the Indigenous Languages Act passed before the next federal election and introduced in the House. We want this child welfare legislation passed and introduced in the House soon. And C-262, the private members bill dealing with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So we have a very tight time frame, but we've got to get this done.
Okay. The minister also mentioned that there was differing degrees of enthusiasm from the provinces. This is incredibly dependent on the provinces. Are you optimistic that you're going to get any take-up, a cooperation, and that this will work?
Well, again, there's Section 88 of the Indian Act. Laws of general application apply. So if ideally, there should be First Nations Child and Family Services Acts in place, as an act of self-determination to occupy the field. I've always told our chiefs, go beyond the Indian Act, exert your own laws, so occupy the field so that federal law, provincial laws don't apply, but your laws apply. So of course there's going to be some challenges from the provincial governments and territorial governments because it's a jurisdictional piece. Yeah. And so, but what this does, and it's about the children, So nobody should argue with that. Let's get to the table and establish all these bilats, trilats in every province and territory to fix the system.
If Indigenous people, and in your case First Nations across the country, are going to have autonomy, are going to take control, are going to take more agency over these services for children at risk, is there going to be a standard, or is there going to be a massive patchwork quilt?
No, it's healthy, it's basically keeping First Nations children and their families and communities and nations in their homes, in loving, caring homes. We want to see a system that incorporates language and culture and ceremony. That's part of our way. Right now, the systems are foreign. Children are language, and they're lost. So there's a chance now right across Canada to get this done in a good way. And I would encourage the provincial and territorial governments to work with First Nations governments to get this done. All this enabling legislation is basically saying, let's get to work now. There's some legislation in place that's going to drive change. And First Nations are ready for this change.
Okay, a blunt question.
Yeah.
In a future system, would there ever be case for removing Indigenous children at risk from an abusive, even to remove them to another agency, to an Indigenous-run agency, but outside of the community? Would there ever be cause for removing children from the community?
Again, that's something down the road. We want to make sure First Nations children are in loving, caring homes, surrounded by their families, surrounded by their communities and nations.
But it is a question that you have to address.
It's a question that will have to be addressed. Of course, there's going to be proper standards in place. It's all about looking after the children's needs, and that's the most important thing. And I think there's an opportunity now to get it done and get it done right. There's 40,000 children in care across Canada. That's not acceptable. This is the fastest growing segment of Canada's population. Canada's got an aging workforce. You got a human capital, the fastest growing pool here that you should tap into. So this is an investment in human capital, and let's get it done right.
If you repatriate, which is the aim, all these services and these responsibilities and the criteria for determining what children are removed maybe from families, if you repatriate all that, could this all be very hollow and even more negative if there's not sufficient funding?
Well, you got to have the proper resources in place, but it's all about respecting jurisdiction. You know, we have rights as First Nations people. One of the most important right we have is the right to self-determination. We have our own languages, our own lands, our own laws, our own people, and our identifiable forms of government. So developing a First Nations Child and Family Services Act to replace a Provincial Services Act is just an extension of self-determination. And I think that's a positive thing. So there's a jurisdiction piece that all has to be worked out. Federal government, provincial government, but First Nations governments. And there's an opportunity now to focus on children to get it done well. And so I think calling all governments to the table, it just makes sense. There's too many children in care. We've got to provide hope and inspiration that there's a better future for them.
Last question, just briefly. We've discussed so many times something that is on reserve, but it's child welfare, and that was the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ordered two compliance orders to the federal government. The federal government finally said it would comply and narrow that gap, a 30% difference of funding for Indigenous children compared to non-Indigenous children. Where are things at in terms of funding now?
It's coming down now because there were 4 compliance orders, not 2. Okay. And there was a unanimous vote in the House of Commons to support this and get this done to end discrimination. So the funding is, in the last fiscal frameworks, last federal budgets, there was resources to deal with that issue. And the bigger issue is make sure that Jordan's principle is implemented right across Canada. No more bickering about who should pay, federal government, provincial government. These are children's needs, and services and programs should be there and put in place for them. So it's flowing now. So that deals with the on-reserve system, ICFS. You know, there was discrimination, racism there, but now, like I say, we have to extend now jurisdiction to off-reserve, and that's what this act will facilitate.
Okay, Perry Bellegarde, thank you very much. We will watch this with interest as we see the next legislative session next year. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for the opportunity.